When American forces crossed into the approaches of Metz and Aachen in the late summer and fall of 1944, they believed momentum was finally on their side. They had broken out of Normandy, smashed German forces in the Falaise pocket, and advanced across France with a speed no one had predicted. But as the U.S. Army reached the fortified edges of Germany, the nature of the war changed abruptly. The open terrain that had allowed sweeping armored maneuvers vanished, replaced by concrete bunkers, steel doors, buried communication tunnels, and interlocking kill zones designed decades earlier and perfected by the Wehrmacht. The Americans had stumbled into a fortress war for which they were utterly unprepared. Metz was the first warning. The city itself was ancient, but around it stood 22 major forts, once part of the French defensive belt, and now occupied, improved, and interconnected by German engineers of the 462nd Volksgrenadier Division. These forts, Jeanne d'Arc, Driant, Saint-Privat, sat on dominating high ground, ringed with minefields, trenches, and casemate artillery. When Third Army units probed the defenses, they discovered something they had not faced since Normandy: an enemy who did not retreat. Sherman tanks rolled forward expecting resistance to crumble, but instead met pre-sighted artillery fire from guns buried in reinforced concrete. Infantry platoons advanced across fields only to be cut down by MG-42s firing from loopholes no more than a few inches wide. Engineers sent to breach obstacles found mines layered 3 and 4 deep, often concealed under wet leaves or shallow mud. At Fort Driant, the U.S. 5th Infantry Division suffered heavy casualties simply trying to reach the entrances. Flamethrowers and satchel charges could scorch the concrete skin, but could not penetrate the fortress's shell. Worse still, German counterattacks launched through covered corridors struck without warning. The Americans were learning a brutal truth: firepower and mobility meant little against an enemy embedded inside the earth itself. Then came Aachen, the first German city the U.S. Army would fight for. If Metz was a fortress built of concrete, Aachen was a fortress built of rubble. Every house had become a bunker, every basement a machine gun nest, every street a gauntlet of mines and interlocking fire. Units of the 1st Infantry Division entered expecting urban resistance, but what they found was a meticulously prepared defensive network designed to stall them at every corner. German troops used the ruins brilliantly. A collapsed wall became a firing slit. A pile of masonry disguised a crew ready with a Panzerfaust at 20 meters. MG-42 teams shifted from floor to floor through pre-cut interior holes, making them nearly impossible to track. When Shermans attempted to advance down the narrow streets, the Germans let them pass, then attacked from above or behind, striking at the turret ring or rear armor. The tanks could not pivot or elevate fast enough to respond. American infantry without close armor support fared little better. The traditional tactics of rushing a building failed when every approach was booby-trapped and every window concealed a rifleman. The U.S. Army, which had thrived in fluid maneuver warfare, now found itself immobilized by a defense that required slow, meticulous dissection. The soldiers on the ground began to understand that the German defensive lines at Metz and Aachen were not simply obstacles, but systems. Minefields funneled them into kill zones. Barbed wire forced them into fire lanes covered by overlapping MG-42s. Bunkers supported each other with perfectly coordinated arcs of fire, so that knocking out one only exposed attackers to 2 more. Even artillery could do little. Concrete and earth absorbed the blast, while German observers hidden in deep bunkers directed counterfire that hammered U.S. infantry the moment they gathered in the open. Adding to the problem, American units were not yet skilled at combined arms in dense environments. Sherman tank crews often moved too far ahead of infantry, becoming easy prey for close-range anti-tank weapons. Infantry, in turn, hesitated to advance beside tanks because streets were laced with mines and covered by snipers. Engineers, the troops most needed to breach obstacles, frequently arrived late or were pinned down before reaching the front. Every branch fought bravely, but they fought separately, and the German defenses punished that separation mercilessly. By mid-October 1944, commanders realized they were losing time, men, and initiative. The rapid advance of summer had ended in a grinding halt, measured not in miles but in meters. Metz and Aachen showed that the U.S. Army did not yet possess a cohesive method for breaking fortified systems. Sherman guns were too light for hardened bunkers, infantry too exposed to MG-42 interlocks, artillery too imprecise for pinpoint bunker kills, and engineers too vulnerable without coordinated protection. The Americans were still thinking in terms of firepower and maneuver, while the Germans fought a war of geometry, fields of fire, hardened lines, and overlapping layers of obstacle and concealment. If the U.S. Army wanted to break into Germany, it would have to change the way it fought. It would have to bind its branches, armor, infantry, artillery, engineers, into a single synchronized machine that could tear apart defenses designed to withstand sieges. Metz and Aachen were not just battles, they were revelations, and the lessons written in blood would force the Americans to rebuild their doctrine from the ground up. The first real shock to American armored units came not from German tanks, but from the realization that their own tactics, so successful in France, were suddenly useless against fixed defenses. In the open fields of Normandy, a Sherman could maneuver, fire, and flank. In the breakout across France, it could lead a column traveling 20 miles in a day. But at Metz and Aachen, the Sherman became something it had never been before: predictable, exposed, and alone. At Metz, the problem revealed itself brutally. When the 7th Armored and 5th Infantry Divisions tried to support one another against the fortress ring, their timing and spacing fell apart almost immediately. Sherman tanks rolled forward down muddy roads that funneled them directly into the arcs of fire of Fort Jeanne d'Arc. The German gunners, safe behind reinforced concrete, had pre-sighted every approach. The moment a Sherman crested a rise or crossed a field, its silhouette triggered a storm of 88mm fire. Tanks that would have survived a glancing hit in open combat now died to plunging fire from elevated casemates. The armor that had been adequate against Panzer IVs or Stugs was meaningless against shells dropping from fortified guns at high angle. Infantry companies attempting to follow the tanks were stalled by thick belts of S-mines and Teller mines laid in overlapping patterns. Engineers trying to breach the fields were cut down by MG-42 teams positioned in recessed firing slits, invisible until they opened fire. Without infantry beside them to clear these kill zones, the Shermans advanced into a void where every threat was invisible and every mistake fatal. And the worst part was not the fire they took, it was the fire they could not deliver. Sherman's 75mm guns were almost useless against bunkers with 8 feet of reinforced concrete. Armor-piercing rounds chipped the surface but did not crack it. High-explosive shells shattered windows and collapsed weak walls, but left casemate entrances untouched. Tank commanders reported repeatedly that they were firing at enemies they could not kill and targets they could not properly see. In Aachen, the situation grew even more desperate. Urban combat removed every advantage a tank possessed. Streets funneled Shermans into narrow corridors where they could neither maneuver nor bring their guns to bear quickly. Buildings masked German movement so completely that a tank could pass within 10 yards of a Panzerfaust team without ever detecting them. Infantry who should have been protecting the tanks lagged behind because the approaches were riddled with mines and sniper fire. The moment the Sherman entered a street unsupported, it became prey. In one infamous action near the theater plots, a Sherman advanced to support a pinned infantry platoon, but the riflemen never reached the tank's position. German defenders deliberately let the Sherman push deeper, then fired 2 Panzerfausts from a second-floor window. The tank caught fire before the infantry even rounded the corner. American officers had long believed that armor should lead and infantry follow, but Aachen proved the opposite. Tanks moving ahead were blind. They could not see into upper floors or side alleys, they could not enter buildings, they could not navigate rubble-choked intersections without exposing their flanks. Without infantry to clear these spaces, the Sherman was a hammer swung in darkness. Infantry alone fared no better. At Metz, rifle companies were pinned for hours by machine guns firing from bunkers they could not reach without tank or artillery support. At Aachen, assault squads charging down a street would run into crossfire from 3 directions. Without tanks to punch holes in walls or suppress upper floors, they were trapped in a deadly maze. And then there were the engineers, the most crucial yet most vulnerable asset. At both Metz and Aachen, their role was indispensable. Clearing mines, gapping wire, placing satchel charges, cutting firing slits, and marking paths for armor. But in the early phase of the campaign, they were rarely brought forward in time. Infantry advanced until they met obstacles. Tanks advanced until they hit mines. Only then were engineers called forward, usually under fire. Many never made it to the obstacles they were meant to neutralize. The consequences were catastrophic. Many after-action reports from Metz read like variations of the same tragedy. Tank hit a mine, infantry pinned, engineers killed before reaching obstacle. The pattern repeated at Aachen. American units were fighting simultaneously, but not together. The battlefield punished that fragmentation. What the U.S. Army faced in Metz and Aachen was not simply strong defenses, but defenses designed explicitly to dismantle uncoordinated attackers. The Germans understood that armor without infantry was blind, infantry without armor was fragile, and engineers without fire support were dead. And so long as the Americans attacked in pieces, every strength they possessed, Sherman's, manpower, artillery, was nullified the moment it reached the battlefield. Metz and Aachen forced a reckoning. The U.S. Army could not break Germany's defensive lines with firepower alone. It needed something far more difficult than courage or material. It needed orchestration. And that lesson would become the foundation of the transformation still to come. By late October 1944, the infantrymen who fought around Metz and Aachen understood that the German defensive system was not something they could outshoot or outrun. It had to be unmade, room by room, bunker by bunker, trench by trench. The war that had once moved in sweeping mechanized arcs now collapsed into a brutal, intimate struggle fought at distances so close American soldiers could hear German commanders shouting orders from behind concrete walls. The first step toward breaking the German line was accepting that riflemen, not tanks, would open the path. At Metz, this meant confronting the fortress ring directly. The 5th Infantry Division found themselves attacking not houses, but medieval casemates, reinforced by modern concrete. German troops inside Fort Dryant moved through underground passages, popping up behind the Americans like ghosts. Machine guns fired from slots smaller than a fist. Every approach was mined, every depression masked an interlocking field of fire. The infantry learned quickly that rushing a bunker head-on was suicide. Instead, they crawled through wet grass and mud until they were close enough to place charges or lob grenades through ventilation shafts. Squads covered each other by firing into firing slits with BARs, hoping to suppress the unseen gunners long enough for the point man to close the final yards. The battle became a duel of senses, listening for a change in the pitch of machine gun bursts to know when Germans were shifting positions underground. At Aachen, the infantry had to adapt even more radically. The city was a labyrinth of rubble, cellars, collapsed roofs, and fortified rooms, each one a potential kill zone. German paratroopers of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division fought with a ferocity that stunned even veterans. They turned every house into a miniature fortress, cutting mouse holes through walls so they could move invisibly from room to room. American riflemen could not rely on street crossings or frontal entries, so they learned to copy their enemy. Engineers blasted holes in sidewalls with demolition charges, creating internal corridors that bypassed the exposed streets where Panzerfaust teams waited. Infantry squads advanced through buildings instead of around them, moving like water through stone. The rifleman with the bar became the cornerstone of every assault. His job was to drown windows, doorways, and rubble tiles in suppressive fire, while grenadiers approached with smoke and fragmentation. Each squad evolved into a small machine with clearly defined roles. One man watched upper floors, another scanned basements, another prepared to flank, and another carried explosives or flamethrowers. What had once been an infantry platoon became an assault system. Close-range weapons dominated these battles. Grenades were used in such quantities that supply sergeants struggled to keep pace. Rifle grenade launchers fired HE rounds into attic positions. Flamethrower teams followed directly behind riflemen to clear rooms that could not be safely entered. In Metz, Flamethrowers became one of the few weapons capable of making Germans abandon armored embrasures. The shock and heat punched through morale even when concrete resisted bullets. Meanwhile, 60mm mortars were dragged into alleys and fired at impossible angles to strike rooftop machine gun nests. Infantry combat became a craft, a sequence of actions rehearsed under fire rather than in training grounds hundreds of miles away. But the most meaningful change was mental. American riflemen learned to view the battlefield not in terms of enemy units, but in terms of enemy positions. They no longer thought a company is holding this line. Instead, they thought 3 MG pits cover this intersection, 2 snipers command this roof, 1 bunker sees the road. The German defense had to be understood as a network of nodes, each one feeding the others. The job of the infantry was to break the network piece by piece so that the entire line unraveled. This new mindset reshaped the rhythm of battle. Instead of mass assaults, companies advanced in small fire teams, each responsible for clearing a single structure or strongpoint. After securing it, they called the platoon forward, then the company. Progress was slow but methodical. When riflemen captured a building, engineers immediately swept it for traps, wired doors, mines under furniture, booby-trapped stairwells. Only then could Shermans move past it. Every yard forward was purchased with sweat and precision. Artillery also became an inseparable partner. Forward observers attached to infantry units began calling 105mm shells onto bunker entrances and fortified windows with increasing accuracy. They used white phosphorus to blind machine gun crews, marking targets for Sherman HE rounds. Infantry stopped thinking of artillery as distant firepower and began treating it as an extension of their own rifles. The relationship encouraged bolder infantry movement. If a squad encountered resistance, they dropped into cover and called artillery within 100 yards, even 50 yards of their position, trusting that the timing and accuracy had improved enough to support them in close quarters. By November, it was clear that American infantry were no longer simply attacking. They were solving the German defense. They were learning the shapes of fortifications, the patterns of crossfire, the habits of German defenders who counterattacked immediately if they sensed hesitation. They were developing a shared language of battle built from experience, not manuals, a language of gestures, shortcuts, and instincts. They were becoming the core around which the coming combined arms revolution would form. The infantry had learned to survive the German fortress system. Now they would learn to break it. By late October, it was clear that American infantry were no longer simply attacking. They were solving the German defense. They were learning the shapes of fortifications, the patterns of crossfire, the habits of German defenders who counterattacked immediately if they sensed hesitation. They were developing a shared language of battle built from experience, not manuals, a language of gestures, shortcuts, and instincts. They were becoming the core around which the coming combined arms revolution would form. The infantry had learned to survive the German fortress system. Now they would learn to break it. What emerged from the blood-soaked lessons of Metz and Aachen was not a gradual improvement, but a sudden crystallization, a realization across divisions and corps that no single branch of the U.S. Army could defeat the German defensive system alone. Armor, infantry, artillery, and engineers each possessed strengths and vulnerabilities that, when isolated, the Germans exploited ruthlessly. But when woven together into a synchronized assault machine, they became the instrument that finally cracked the fortresses guarding Germany's frontier. The transformation began when officers in the field stopped thinking in terms of sequential operations, infantry first, then armor, then engineers, and started treating the battlefield as a single living organism requiring simultaneous action. The new formula unfolded in 5 tightly coordinated stages, each dependent on the others. First came the engineers. No longer brought forward only after an advance stalled, they now served as the vanguard, probing the ground mere yards ahead of riflemen. Using mine detectors, Bangalore torpedoes, and satchel charges, they cleared lanes through minefields and wire obstacles under the protective umbrella of infantry fire. Their role was no longer to fix problems, but to prevent them. A Sherman that never hit a mine, an infantry squad that never walked into wire, an assault line that never became disorganized under fire, all because engineers had already shaped the path. Second came the infantry screen. American commanders realized that Shermans could not survive urban rubble or fortress approaches unless riflemen pressed close enough to protect them. At Aachen, infantry literally hugged tank holes as they advanced, firing into windows and doorways at point-blank range to suppress Panzerfaust teams. In Metz, riflemen crawled ahead of armor, marking targets and clearing trench pockets that could disable a tank at 10 meters. The Germans found that every time they lifted a Panzerfaust to fire, a bar or Garand round struck before they could aim. The infantry were not an escort, they were the sensory system of the armored spearhead. Third came the Shermans. Once disastrously exposed, they now fought as part of a breathing organism. Their 75mm high-explosive rounds pounded bunker apertures, collapsed second floors, and blasted breaches in thick walls so infantry could enter without facing door-mounted traps. The tanks no longer advanced blindly, but responded to infantry calls, rotating turrets toward threats spotted only by men on the ground. Sherman commanders learned to fire recons by cannon, shelling suspicious rubble piles or loopholes before anyone could confirm a target. The bright flash and concussion not only cleared enemy positions, but shocked German defenders accustomed to American hesitation. Fourth came the artillery, the backbone of the breakthrough formula. The 105mm howitzer became the most flexible tool in the American arsenal. Artillery officers perfected time-on-target missions, coordinating fire so that dozens of shells struck simultaneously, saturating German strongpoints before defenders could take cover. At Metz, this technique proved decisive. Forts that had shrugged off isolated barrages began to buckle under synchronized impacts. Ventilation shafts twisted shut, embrasures cracked, and communication trenches collapsed. At Aachen, forward observers worked alongside infantry inside buildings, calling strikes only 50 to 75 yards away. The Germans, once confident in their fortified nests, found themselves buried under precision fire that hit exactly where American ground units needed it. Finally came the assault teams, the scalpel of the combined arms system. These teams, usually 5 to 8 men, mixing engineers and infantry, approached bunkers using smoke screens laid by Shermans or 105mm phosphorus rounds. They crawled low under suppressive fire, planting TNT or satchel charges at bunker doors, ventilation ducts, or seams in the concrete. If the charge failed to breach the fort, flamethrower crews swept forward to pour fire through the opening. These actions were not ad hoc, they became standard. Every bunker that fell opened a new lane. Every lane allowed armor and infantry to surge forward. The Germans, who had once dominated the defense, found themselves reacting to a rhythm of attack unlike anything they had faced earlier in the war. A Sherman gun thundered, infantry poured through the smoke, engineers cut wire, artillery struck behind the defenders to block retreat, and assault teams finished the bunker. This was not a chaotic battlefield. It was choreography. It was the U.S. Army becoming a machine. German defenders at Metz and Aachen wrote after the war that the Americans had become predictably unstoppable. Not because the U.S. Army was flawless, far from it, but because the method left no weakness uncovered. If a machine gun suppressed infantry, a Sherman silenced it. If a Panzerfaust appeared, riflemen killed it. If a bunker slowed the attack, engineers and artillery broke it apart. The formula did not just work, it changed the war. And on the plains of Lorraine, in the rubble of Aachen, and along the Saar River, American units finally proved that the German fortress system, once thought impenetrable, could be dismantled not by power alone, but by precision, timing, and unity. The U.S. Army had found the key. Now it was time to use it. By December 1944, the formula tested in Metz and perfected in Aachen had matured into a battlefield doctrine that no longer resembled the hesitant American approach of the early autumn. The U.S. Army had discovered that once armor, infantry, engineers, and artillery operated as one synchronized machine, the German defensive system began to unravel. Not instantly, not easily, but predictably. Each assault became a sequence. each strongpoint a problem with a known solution. The fortress war that had once slowed entire corps to a crawl was now something the Americans could dismantle, bunker by bunker, street by street, ridge by ridge. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the fighting that swept across the Saar region in late 1944 and early 1945. The Siegfried Line, Germany's west wall, loomed ahead with its rows of concrete dragon's teeth, pillboxes, mine belts, and interlocking bunkers. The Germans believed it would halt the Americans just as Metz had. But the Americans who reached the west wall were not the same army that had staggered in front of Fort Driant. When the 90th Infantry Division advanced toward the Saar-Lauterbruch bridgehead, they brought with them not just Sherman companies, but dedicated engineer battalions already rehearsing breach operations. At the first sign of dragon's teeth, engineers deployed explosive charges while infantry established suppressive fire. Shermans then fired point-blank HE to dislodge German infantry attempting to counterattack. Behind them, the 105mm guns delivered rolling barrages that blinded pillbox observation slits in white phosphorus smoke. German strongpoints designed to hold for days fell in hours. The rhythm of American attacks changed fundamentally. Instead of stalling at the first layer of obstacles, they burst through them and immediately pressed deeper, denying the defenders time to reorganize. The combined arms method created momentum where previously there had been none. Tanks that once hesitated at unknown minefields now trusted the path engineers cleared. Infantry who once waited for armor now advanced side by side with the Shermans, confident the tanks would shatter whatever bunker waited ahead. Assault teams flowed naturally behind the leading platoons, each squad already knowing its role without needing detailed orders. The reaction from German defenders was telling. At Aachen, they had fought down to the last grenade because they controlled the tempo of battle. In the Saar, they increasingly found themselves outpaced, overwhelmed, and disoriented. American artillery cut off counterattack routes. Engineers blasted open new lanes before defenders could shift MG positions. Sherman smashed firing slits that once forced infantry to take cover. The precision that German doctrine demanded began to collapse under the constant American pressure. What had once been a chess match became a sledgehammer wrapped in intelligence. Even veteran units like the 11th Panzer Division noted that the Americans had become systemized. Their attacks unfolded with predictable steps but overwhelming force. There was no weakness to exploit. Kill the infantry screen and the Shermans closed in. Disable a Sherman and artillery pounded the point of resistance. Destroy an assault team and the engineers laid smoke to bring up another. Every German success triggered an American counteraction already baked into the method. It was this reliability, not just firepower, that broke the West Wall. Consider the seizure of pillboxes north of Saar-Lauterbruch. German officers reported being shocked at how swiftly U.S. troops transitioned from approach to breach to consolidation. One pillbox was struck by Shermans from the front, suppressed by 105mm fire from the rear, assaulted by engineers from a blind side, and cleared by infantry within 20 minutes. In earlier battles, such a fortress might have held up a battalion for half a day. Now it was simply one more node to eliminate. The Americans did not conquer the West Wall by brute strength alone. They conquered it by removing the time the Germans needed to fight. By February 1945, the U.S. Army had achieved something unprecedented, a consistent, repeatable method for defeating German fortifications, one adaptable to villages, forests, hills, and concrete citadels alike. When they reached the Rhine, the success at Aachen and Metz echoed everywhere. At Remagen, when the Ludendorff Bridge was captured intact, engineers moved into action instantly to cut demolition wires, while artillery suppressed the far bank. Infantry pushed across under fire, while tanks assembled at the approaches, ready to exploit. It was not chaos, it was choreography. The same principles applied in a new context. Combined arms, perfected through costly trial, had become instinct. And once the Americans crossed the Rhine, nothing the Germans built, no bunker, no trench, no fortified line, could slow them again. The U.S. Army had entered the autumn of 1944 as a force powerful but fragmented. It ended the winter of 1945 as a unified weapon of overwhelming precision. Metz had taught them humility. Aachen had taught them adaptation. The Saar had taught them mastery. And together, these lessons forged the army that would break Germany's last defenses and carry the war to its final end.